So this is another episode of Talk to Thorin, and my guest for this episode is LS. Won't run through the whole biography. Short version: was a coach in NA, was a caster in Korea. Again, we're not going into any of the reasons, no longer any of these things. Now an analyst in the world, just the world, and streamer also in the world. So one of the things we're going to talk about is, obviously I've had LS on many of my shows, some of the Insight Narrative Wake as a guest, but in light of TSM's shocking elimination from Group D of the Season 7 World Championship, where they were the favourite team to get out of the group, at the very least once in one or two, arguably, when you consider the strength coming into the tournament, a lot of people even could have said they should have 6-0'd the group. They didn't, and they didn't even get out of the group. And in fact, one of the teams that obviously upset them was Misfits, a team that coming in looked like one of the weaker Western seeds. And so, as opposed to just having LS as one of many guests on a show and maybe getting to some of these topics, we wanted to go a bit deeper, but on this one topic. So it's the topic of TSM at Worlds, but obviously within that, we've got 6 matches, well, 7, there's a tiebreaker as well. 7 matches we can talk about, got all the different players, and obviously at the moment, it's a very discussed topic. It's just that, because it's Reddit, one of the areas Reddit is actually quite poor for is discussions, because obviously people get upvoted and downvoted, and you get these very skewed discussions, which that might sound like a very pointless, like redundant point to most people who are from the modern day of the internet, because they're only used to Reddit and things like that. They don't realize if you come from the old days where people like me and you used to go on sites like Team Liquid, there were versions like that for Quake, etc. Because it's just a flat forum. In fact, there wasn't even any way to directly reply to somebody. You had to like quote their comment or tag them in, etc. It meant that actually one of the positives is, yeah, you don't curate in theory the most popular opinion, but it means that any opinion is justifiable actually. Like you can just make an opinion, and what can they do to you? They can't downvote you, they can just say they disagree. So what's good is it meant that if you ever read through these things, you could get very different opinions to what everyone else holds. So let me just start here, Ellis. I'll start with a really big topic and a simple one probably to start out with. Coming into this group, do you agree with that? Should TSM have just dominated this group and been through to the quarterfinals?
I mean, right before Worlds started, I watched some of TSM's final week games for summer, because that's just basically what I do for other regions before Worlds kicks off. And I mean, it was basically, I had the same exact opinion that I had in previous years, that I'm not impressed because that they're winning in dominating fashion, mostly because things that I want to see happening or that could be happening aren't. And so against world-class teams, I don't expect too much to occur because they're going to be met with a greater opposition. So if a diamond player is playing against a bronze player, of course, they're going to look fantastic. But when, you watch 2 diamond level players play, sometimes you'll feel like one of the players is actually, or the game level looks worse. But the reality is that both parties understand what each other are capable of. And so you end up feeling like a team or a player looks worse than they actually are. So I wasn't expecting them to just dominate the group by any means. I know a lot of people thought that it should have been a shoo-in. After having watched some of the other games that I didn't before the group kicked off, I did think that TSM should have made it out of groups, but they didn't in the end. So yeah.
Well, I mean, that's a key point to make, isn't it? That one of the other reasons why people thought they should have gotten out, and why every analyst I know had them getting out, is because they also did get a group that, in theory, there are no threats in. Like, that sounds weird, but WE was actually, in theory, supposed to be the worst of the Chinese teams. They obviously barely got in through the gauntlet. Then you had Flash Wolves, who, despite winning LMS, and who, by the way, are actually the number 1 seed in that group, obviously have looked pretty bad and didn't, in fact, look that great as the group played out anyway. And then the other team's Misfits, a team that I've got a bunch of rookies, people who've never played internationally before, and yeah, they had moments where they looked good, like against Fnatic at LCS, but still nothing that would make you think they're going to beat a team with Bjergsen and Double Lift and and an ALCS champion. So okay, let's get into some of the specifics then. So when I did my video on it, I started, and the person I actually kind of gave the most props to was actually Hodzer, who a lot of people for some reason imagine I think shit, which I've never said ever in my entire life, but that's how straw men work. So I actually thought in general, when you consider he had a lot of problems at last Worlds, I thought he did pretty good at this one. I mean, his team lost, so it's hard to look like he did well. You were telling me you were pretty critical of Hotz's performance here. So start there then. That's obviously one of the ones people would think he'd look over. Why do you think he looked good to some people, but you thought that he was an issue?
So basically what we were saying right before, a second ago on the call or something, before this all started, was that what I realized is that when I was watching the TSM games, even on stream, one of the trends that kept occurring is that Haunter looked like the savior, or he looked like the hero, but the reality was that TSM were finding themselves in really rough spots because of choices that Haunter was making, and then he would get them out of that spot with some mechanical flashy play, and that's all that Reddit remembers. And the other problem with this is that you would have to first be able to see that Haunter's making a mistake on a macro level, or like a pathing level. Right. And most people aren't going to see that. So all that they're going to see is Haunter wins lane by CS or something, and they think that it's a win, even though the matchup might mean that it's actually not a win, it's just expected or something. And then what they'll see is that Haunter just randomly goes to a lane or something, but he shouldn't just be pathing the way that he is. He should have been doing something else. And because he didn't path the way that he was supposed to, on the surface, it looks all fine, right? Because you're not seeing the fight unfold, you're not seeing a rotation unfold or anything like that. There's no fireworks yet. But then because he's somewhere else on the map that TSM needed him not to be, or because he didn't have teleport available to him, or because he teleports to a weird location, TSM gets into all these really rough spots. And then the public doesn't remember Haunter as doing poorly in any of the games because he has these really mechanical, flashy plays. Like one of the notes that I wrote down was that in the TSM Flash Wolves game, everyone's probably going to remember Haunter winning lane with CS, Haunter killing MMD, and then almost getting Maple as well, getting the flash out of him. They'll remember Haunter's 5-man Gnar ultimate and all these other things. And the reality of the situation is that Haunter's pathing in the mid game at numerous different points, and just even transitioning from mid to late game, was the primary reason that TSM was in these really rough spots in the first place. But it's obviously not as obvious.
Can you give an example then? Like, is there one that comes to mind?
I think one comes to mind is that he's going to path down into bottom, and instead he could have just let Cho'Gath. This is game 1, Flash Wolves TSM.
Right. Okay.
He could have ran from base to his team, and then Cho'Gath would be forced. Gnar. Yeah, Gnar.
Okay. Yes. Okay.
So he could have ran from base to his team and then try to force Cho'Gath to give up bottom lane and have the bottom lane come in to TSM. And he could have used that to try to secure like a teleport advantage or just a positional advantage on the map relative to the current state of the game. Instead, he's already ahead. He has a CS advantage. He wants to extend his lead. He wants to go into the split push. So on the surface, it looks like, oh, Haunter's just following lane assignments and going down into bottom lane so we can continue to get an edge over Cho'Gath. That's all fine and dandy, but there was a bigger advantage that could have been secured if he pathed differently. He could have ended up achieving the same situation. It just would have been delayed. It would have been slightly delayed, but the potential advantage that could have been gained by just pathing differently would have meant that he would have taken a little bit of a slight delay in like his power spikes or scaling ahead or getting himself fed in exchange for potentially propelling his team massively far ahead and removing any chance Flash Wolves would have to do some of these things that ended up hurting TSM. Okay. And it's an example of something that every time and I'm not going to say that some Korean teams don't do this because they do, they're no angels. The obsession that Western players have over minuscule amounts of gold is mind-boggling to me. Like, literally the Haunter thing that I'm talking about right now would have meant that he would have had to have given up 150 gold or something in minions, 150, maybe 200 gold. And it's that he's not willing to part with the 200 gold that is guaranteed if he just simply goes down to the lane because he doesn't.
Do you think he actually knows that though? Do you think he was even considering any of this? He just came and thought, "Oh, I can get this farm, right?"
I don't think. Well, because sometimes, I feel like there's 4 steps to decisions in a way. One is the decision that involves only you. One is the leveling process, which involves what does the opponent want, and then there's the leveling process, which is I know that the opponent knows that I know this, which is like a poker thing. You keep going back and forth, and then you have to find the trade-off.
Sure.
And then the 4th one is finding a decision that can beat all the leveling processes and enables you an advantage. Like, no matter what ends up occurring, we edge out here ever so slightly. Yes. The fourth step is something people often don't do. I mean, fuck, people don't do the third step half the time. You know, they're worried and preoccupied with themselves. So I think that it's because of how frequently this occurs in TSM's games, specifically with Haunter and all the Worlds games. I don't think it's being factored in. I don't think it's being entertained.
Okay, and is this an example? Obviously, I don't expect you to have watched every NALCS game, but do you think this is a thing unique to how you played at Worlds, or does this exist and just in NALCS it doesn't matter?
So, this is an analogy that you get, and maybe a few other people who watch this video will get. I think that basically what Haunter is doing is it's sort of like when a Korean in StarCraft would go to an event and they would just do a very generic, safe build order because it doesn't matter if they get a disadvantage or not. They know that they win anyway. NA players aren't capable of or NA teams aren't capable with such consistency that TSM and Haunter would be forced to adapt. Like, maybe they'll catch TSM, off guard with it once, but it doesn't even necessarily mean that they'll beat TSM in the game. So TSM won't go back and evaluate it and assess this is a really big problem. We can't do something like this. We can't have you path like this. So TSM ends up getting away with a lot of stuff simply because the opposition is worse. And so TSM goes into these tournaments and they play their own game. But something like what I was saying on stream earlier, Haunter might be better than other, NA top laners inside of NA. Svenskeren might be better than other junglers inside of NA. And then because top and mid are 2v2 lanes, Haunter Svenskeren might be a better 2v2 dynamic than, the enemy top, enemy jungle. And then you factor in Svenskeren Bjergsen, then you factor in double lift Biofrost, are going to have a lot of edges down in bottom lane versus other teams, etc. And you get all of these scenarios that will end up occurring and unfolding where Haunter's not asked to do advanced things anymore in order to win lane. He can just sort of do it without thinking. So when you arrive at the world stage, all of these things that I think that they don't even think about start occurring, and suddenly the advantages that they would normally find themselves having are not being found anymore. And the type of pressure relief that Haunter could expect to have inside of mid lane or bottom lane is not occurring anymore. And so now it's almost like they're just sitting and they're waiting to die, which is, a lot of people have talked about this on Reddit, Twitter, etc., that it just seems like, TSM isn't doing anything. They have no proactivity. They have no aggression, yada, yada, yada. So I think that what ends up occurring is even if Haunter is hypothetically a better top laner than his opponent, it doesn't mean that him and Sven are a better 2v2. Okay. Or that, Sven and Bjergsen are a better 2v2. And so because there's even potentially a trade-off in a lane that doesn't even directly involve Haunter, it does involve him, because in NA, how often are you going to say that? How often are you going to say that the enemy team has a better jungle mid than you? In a 2-on-2 scenario? How often does an enemy bot lane beat double lift Biofrost with Svenskeren? So there's all those added external pressures that Haunter can't control, but it ultimately ties in to how he's going to play the game.
Okay,
even
so
without realizing.
That's, to me, an obvious question that this raises. Okay, so on Twitter today, I saw you were kind of fighting in the corner of Path, saying that, people wanting to fire him and saying he's not the right coach. Is you were outraged by this, but we're talking about game one against Flash Wolves. Why? Their coach presumably isn't picking up on these things, or if he tells the players, they don't do anything differently. You think the coach missed this? It's probably entirely plausible that Parth missed it. But my gripe is the reason for why he's being removed isn't being talked about. There are people that are delusional and they think that TSM is losing because of draft. When I looked at all of the games... Okay. So generally, so they played 7 games, right? Obviously, rough number here. How many do you think that they did badly in the draft out of 7?
So I had for their first game that they had a neutral/losing draft. I had for game 2 versus we that they won draft. I asked myself though, why was Ezreal banned again? And then I thought that they won versus Misfits. I thought that they won versus we in draft. I think even in the very final game, the tiebreaker game, right? A lot of people criticize that draft. I tried asking myself, okay, let me put this into the perspective of Misfits as SKT and KT is TSM. Like let me give those players those champions. And even then, I can only say that it's like a 55-45 or like a 60-40, like ever so slightly. But in the early to mid transition, TSM's comps ahead. So, I mean, it comes down to execution. So there were some really thin spots where you could say that TSM lost draft, but not really. I had it down that TSM won more drafts than they lost. And even when they lost it, it wasn't even really just a true loss. It's something like what I'm describing, where the tiebreaker game, they're ahead if they know what to do. But then the longer that the game goes on, it ends up swaying into Misfits' favor. Could stuff have been different in the draft?
Let me ask you a few questions then. I'll give you a few specifics. Okay. So obviously a problem here is that, let's be real, most people probably didn't say, oh my God, they lost draft, the second the draft happened. A lot of people are like, now they know what the result is, they know what the implications of the loss is. Now they're looking back and they're saying, right, well, this player did badly on this champion, so it was poorly drafted. But obviously, if you're the coach, right, if your player is terrible on that champion, you obviously shouldn't draft it. But if it's a one-off game where they do badly, you might have drafted correctly, but the player misplayed it. So here's a question for you, okay? One player who obviously took a lot of criticism, and especially in that tiebreaker, is Bjergsen. And Bjergsen chose to go on to Rise, as he has actually, in fact, he did that same thing last year. For some reason, this is the champion he chose to go to in the big pressure game. Or let his coach draft him, one of the two, right? That's perfectly, you thought that was a perfectly fine choice for Bjergsen? Did he just not use it? Did he misplay it? What's your take on that?
I mean, I think that they should have gone with Orianna instead of Jace when they had option. A lot of people say that the Jace is still able to be flexed. I would never put Hanser on Jace, but I think that if I were to change the draft up in any way,
okay. So tell me this thing quickly. When they did that flex, then what were they? Well, normally when you do a flex, you're trying to gain an edge on the other team because they think you've got a max up, so they think it's Jace versus something, and then you're just going to switch it up and go somewhere else. But it doesn't make sense to do that if it makes your actual team weaker. So when you're saying this, like, what did they think they were getting out of flexing the Jace to the top?
Honestly, I have no idea there. I feel like the only thing, again, that could have maybe been changed in my point of view, from having just watched the game a few hours ago again, was that fourth pick right after the second ban phase should have just been Orianna. Would have taken it away from the opponent's team. Fundamentally, with how the team composition could still operate, it would be very similar, and it would probably enable you to be a little bit more flexible. Is that why they lost the game? Absolutely not. It's a slight alteration to the draft, and even that alteration would have meant that they would have been weaker in the early part. Whereas I just mentioned before that they had a stronger potential wake up, stronger potential transition. I don't understand the Jace at all. It doesn't mean that it's bad. That there's going to be information that we as the outsiders looking in aren't privy to. I just think that Jace is probably a bad idea for most people unless your name's Khan. But it doesn't make it bad. I don't know why Bjergsen went to Rise in terms of like criticism and whatnot. From watching his laning phase and watching his movements and stuff, people fail to understand that mid's a 2v2. I mean, we're in season 7, we're going to be going into season 8, and people don't talk about this enough, that you can be a fantastic or phenomenal mid laner, but if you're not getting any help from your jungler, or your jungler's not pathing properly, or your laners are creating pressure for you inadvertently, sort of like Double Lift and Biofrost falling behind or something, but I mean, that goes into something in itself that has to do with Sven and Hanser, it's going to look shitty. I mean, from watching all the games,
looked worse because of Sven Skaren?
I think he looked worse because of Sven.
You think Bjergsen played fine?
I mean, I don't see what he alone could have been doing. I mean, and
didn't he often let the other mid roam, like for example, Power of Evil? Didn't he often let them roam and just like dive bot, and he just stayed mid and just farmed and stuff?
Yeah, but I don't think that's I think that looking at it that way is sort of like result based, right? Because where was Sven Skaren to enable Bjergsen to play the lane out accordingly so that he could play aggressively enough to prevent a shove or restrict them from roaming or something like that. Okay. To say that mid laners can just flip a switch and go aggressive randomly while being surrounded by fog of war, or not knowing exactly where the enemy jungler is, or not having your jungler within close proximity, etc. All of these things play into laning phase. I remember the Jace roam when Bjergsen was on Rise and he has to try to run down to bottom lane to save Double Lift and Biofrost. That entire thing was a byproduct of Haunter fucking wasting teleport like an idiot. Like I don't know how no one brought that up minutes prior. Bjergsen did what he had to do. It was a forced thing that he had to run to try to help Double Lift and Biofrost, and he runs through his blue side jungle, and he just sort of sits there doing nothing. I mean, he was ahead on CS up until that point. He was winning in lane the first few levels, but then the top laner blew it. I'm not saying that Haunter's an idiot, by the way. I'm saying that the choice that he made to teleport prior was poor, because it enabled that situation to occur that compromises Bjergsen, it compromises Double Lift and Biofrost, and then Svenskaren's pathing that game up until that point doesn't help either. I mean, Bjergsen was trying to stop the bleeding. If it ends up making him look like an idiot in the process, I don't really care. Okay. Because when the floodgates are breaking all around you and you try to do your best to hold them together, you're still going to look like an idiot if you can't. So it's a really weird scapegoat. Yeah.
So one of the things that is, I mean, to me, it's been confusing before even Worlds. Like, I never really understood what TSM coaches thought they were doing with Svenskeren as a jungler all year long, pretty much. Mm-hmm. Like, he's someone where, if you ever watched the EULCS, he was like a really strong, like 1v1 jungler. Like, he comes into your jungle early, he catches you and he fucks you up, and then that's it. You're behind already. You're scared to go into certain parts. You don't go into his jungle. It's like he actually was a very intimidating player. Then in NA, especially this year, he is just someone who plays dog shit like tank champion. He plays like fucking Gragas or whatever. He just stays in his own side of the jungle farming, and anytime he goes in the other side, it's like he's on his own and he just gets killed or fucked up, or somehow. Like, it's like either you have to believe his confidence is so destroyed, he's literally like subservient and say, I'll do anything, I won't do, or the coaching staff have to be telling him this, He hasn't just for no reason sabotaged his whole game, I imagine. So presumably they want him doing these things. They're telling him to play Gragas only and to do these sorts of moves,
I mean, I can't understand it. I think the two biggest things for me in the majority of the game, like one of the things that stands out to me as being so weird is like there was a game where Double Lift got like super flamed for things that he chose to do, and I was sitting there thinking, well, what Double Lift did so much for his team. Like,
do you know what game it was?
I remember the Kog'Maw invade or something. I can't remember what the team was. He like invades his Kog'Maw level 1. He takes a beating and he has Cull, but then because it's Nami versus Janna, the Nami heals him up and Han Sam is forced to recall. But people are looking at it like Double Lift was an idiot, and then Double Lift dies a few minutes later because he was overly greedy. But he dies because he was overly greedy, in addition to the fact that Haunter blew teleport and the fact that Svenskeren pathed like he had fucking cataracts in both his eyes. So, I mean, it's not really Double Lift's fault entirely. There was a lot of other stuff that played into Double Lift dying than just his own greed and other stuff. Actually, maybe the teleport didn't cause his first death. I think that was just Svenskaren's rooting. Or Svenskaren's path. Yeah. Svenskeren chose to, I think, farm Wraiths instead of pathing in to guarantee that Gragas was not in the left side jungle. At that point, you use no information as information because they saw that Gragas was off a recall. They could count Gragas' CS. You just hit tab, you count the CS, although Vicious would say that's a little bit too complex, but you count the CS, you see that he has the green smite, and if you just simply do not farm Wraiths and you just go into his jungle and you don't find him there, everyone now knows where he must be. It doesn't matter that the Fog of War exists because he simply can't be anywhere else. It's illogical. It's so fucking bad if he is anywhere else, and you can just play around it. So had Svenskeren just done that, it's a surety that he must be bottom, and then you just play accordingly. If that would have happened, Double Lift wouldn't die. But instead, Svenskeren, maybe on the off chance, says, oh, Gragas might be bottom, and he just farms his Wraiths. So there's something that could have been done to outright prevent the problem from occurring, rather than like fixing it or something, and they chose not to do it, and so Double Lift dies. It's not Double Lift's fault. Like that's not something you can blame Double Lift for. So it's stuff like that was occurring all tournament. And the people that were getting blamed were like the weirdest people, like Bjergsen and Doublelift. I feel like Sven and Hanser were the two main problematic players this tournament. Speaking week 1, week 2.
So, okay, let me ask you this then. One of the areas in which Doublelift is obviously a historically famous player is he wins lane. He's very focused on lane. He wants to 2v2 and wants matchups that give him a chance to win lane. Did he do a fine job in that sense at this tournament?
I remember one point where there was the Caitlyn Twitch lane or something, and Sven came and ganked on Jarvan, and then I think that Sven should have ganked immediately again, or Sven should have went to mid lane to relieve pressure. Up until that point, he was doing a fine job in the lane. There was a lot of lanes where he's not supposed to win; he's just supposed to not lose. Just due to the nature of the 2-on-2, right? Because of scaling components or something like that.
Right.
I think he was doing fine. I don't think he was doing fantastic or phenomenal.
So if he did fine in lanes, why isn't he transitioning and then they're going into these team fights where TSM was at their best in an ALCS and they're winning them all? A lot of people would say there's games where he just straight up got caught, right?
There were games where he did straight up get caught. And there were games that stuff that wasn't supposed to occur, in his mid or top lane did happen, and that just puts too much pressure, on his champion. If his champion's designed to scale and try to get out of laning phase or something, and you lose the turret, and then Ryze loses his turret, and then, your top laner doesn't have teleport, and you die, and you end up getting put behind 1 to 2 minutes, etc. All of these things don't have to do with his mechanics or his laning phase. These are all things that involve his teammates, that they're not doing their job to ensure that he gets out of laning phase without all these hiccups and stuff. And it's sort of like he's having to take care of everything while still trying to lane in a sense, but not physically in the game. But what I'm saying is that you can't just look at it like he didn't exit laning phase with the CS leader. He didn't exit laning phase with him and Bio getting a kill. Or he exited laning phase with dying, even though the death isn't entirely his fault. Sort of like the Gragas killing him or something. You can't look at it that way because that's a very surface level analysis. A lot of the problems that Doublelift had weren't entirely because of himself. You could make the argument that, he didn't play good enough to prevent the opponent from even being able to do that in the first place. But some of the matchups you just couldn't. I thought that the thing that he did with the Cognomi versus Zayajana thing where he forces Hansama's recall, but then dies moments later because of greed, I thought that was fantastic. That was good. That was orchestrated entirely by himself. And yet there were people that flamed him for it. So, that was very peculiar to me.
Okay. Well, here's a question then. Let's say your case is that Bjergsen and Doublelift generally played well. They didn't play badly, at least. Mm-hmm. Between the two of them, they're supposed to be two of the best at their roles. Mm-hmm. In the West, definitely. And then actually, they're some of the only Westerners that people put near the Koreans and the Chinese, etc. Collectively, wasn't something missing from their overall games?
I think that they weren't able to exert as much lane dominance and pressure as they normally would be able to. And this is sort of like the stuff I was talking about earlier, where a diamond player looks fantastic when he's bashing on bronzes. But when a diamond player meets another diamond player, or maybe even a platinum player, he doesn't look like he's fantastic. And I think that that's basically what was occurring, is that there needed to be more team play happening. There needed to be more information being funneled, just across the map, and it wasn't occurring. And that really limits what you're able to do.
So one area you've always been super critical of Western teams, and presumably in this case TSM, is the macro, right?
Yeah.
Now, it's not like they lost every game at 23 minutes and they just got pushed in every lane and ganked all over the place. They were in some of these games that went longer. Mm-hmm. What would your assessment be of their macro?
So something I talked about a little bit earlier on, I think I might even have tweeted about it. It seems like TSM, at least from... I say this with such confidence, and just because watching all their games at all of the stages where you would expect certain things from the team compositions, their acknowledgement about an enemy team comp, etc., was just absent from all the games. And what I mean by that is TSM might have a team composition and they would not play out anything that the team comp would want to do. It just sort of seems like they're picking champions rather than picking it with a purpose. And the other thing was they could not seem to evaluate what the enemy team composition wanted.
Can you give an example for one of these, like how they didn't understand their comp, or there was a specific comp they played against where they didn't seem to know what they were going to do?
Yeah, I remember, I think a game, the enemy had Xayah, and I think TSM had Rakan. Let me look this up really quick. I'll find this. Hold on. Yeah, okay, it was this game. All right, so TSM versus We, group stage, October 7th. The game where it's, double lift on Tristana, Bjergsen on Corki, Haunter
they win this game, right?
Haunter on Cho'Gath, yeah. They end up winning the game, but it was the point, it was basically that they didn't seem to acknowledge the enemy team needed the enemy team needed certain things to happen if they were to still have a chance in the game. So it's basically like the game reached a stage where TSM's team composition was allowed to be behind and still be ahead. And what I mean is behind in gold and still retain an advantage. Okay. TSM was ahead. And the enemy team was basically begging for team fights because that's the only way that they can recover. It's the only hope that they have before the game just hits critical point and TSM reasonably can't lose a team fight unless they all go into a coma or something. And despite knowing this, or despite being able to evaluate this just by seeing the two team compositions in the current state of the game, you see TSM still looking to be aggressive rather than just like sitting back and being like, you know what, we're going to just chill out for 15 minutes and then you're going to be fucking, you can't do anything. Like that's just inevitable. It would basically be like an analogy or something. It would be like in StarCraft or something. You can just keep teching up to like defilers or ultralisks or something, but you choose to attack. Even though you're ahead on upgrades and the Terran doesn't have any science vessels, they have no siege tanks, etc. They just have tons of marines and medics, and you don't want to wait for defilers. You just fight. And it doesn't make any sense because if you just wait 10, 15 more minutes, you're going to have too many defilers and they can't do anything to you. So
this tells you that they didn't actually understand the advantage they potentially had.
Yeah, it almost looked like they were clueless as to how far ahead they were. And I don't care if, they had a 70-30 situation presented to them. Oh, well, we're going to win this team fight 70% of the time. Just by doing fucking nothing, you get a 90-10.
Would a Korean team actually do nothing though in that scenario?
Yeah, we've seen Korean teams do something like that. We've seen Korean teams sit back, in similar situations and intentionally force the delay in stability. I mean, SKT are fantastic at doing it in some spots. It looks very boring to watch them sometimes, where it seems like they're doing nothing. They're not being proactive. They're just sort of like catching waves, farming their jungle, keeping vision control and ward coverage up at very specific parts. It looks very, very boring on the surface, right? But it doesn't matter because eventually what ends up occurring is that they hit critical point and their team composition just overrides yours. It's really weird. So situations like this were constantly occurring in TSM games where it was obvious what the opponent wanted and TSM would give it to them because TSM would find a situation that was like favorable, like in the microsecond, like maybe it's a 60-40 or 70-30, and TSM would take it. But why the fuck are you even looking for it in the first place? And then why are you taking it when you can just simply wait? It's illogical to me, Why do that when you can just wait and get a 90-10?
So really are these players just clueless, or is this not coaching again? Learning to identify such things within a game?
I mean, I guess it kind of comes down to coaching again, right? But it doesn't have to do with the reasons that Reddit and the public were blaming Parth. They're literally blaming drafts, but it has nothing to do with the drafts. Okay. If you don't understand how to play the game or how to play the team compositions in which you've been presented, or you're incapable of evaluating the enemy's team composition at every single stage of the game, because I feel like there's like 4 stages to a game, right? There's early game, there's mid game, there's late game, and then there's super late game, right? Which is the 6 item. Everyone has 6 item, and then there's the dances with Elder and Baron, whatever. So if you don't understand how both team comps operate at each stage, and then you have to understand that there's like a list, right? So let's say that, TSM has a team composition that wants to get to 35 minutes. But if the enemy team comp has a team composition that needs to win at 20 minutes, TSM suddenly does not have to play in a way that would let them scale up to 35, 40 minutes. They just have to play in a way that means that they don't lose at 20. Right? Because now suddenly your 35, 40 minute scaling comes online actually sooner because the enemy team comp drafted in a way that enables it to. Just because fundamentally it falls apart. And I mean, I can use comparisons in like trading card games that would make sense to this. It's sort of like playing against like Murlocs in Hearthstone. You don't actually, like if you're playing Exodia Mage or something, which is a Hearthstone deck that relies on stalling out the game and having all this board clear and all this other stuff so that you get to a certain point, so you have all the pieces of the puzzle together and you win. You don't need to get to the piece of the puzzle anymore. All that you have to do is kill all the Murlocs. They don't have any draw engine and they don't have any board. You just win. You don't need the fucking Exodia anymore, right? Okay. But the problem then arises when you have a team that's like, oh no, we still need Exodia. Like they just refuse to fucking end the game without Exodia. So that is present in so many teams. And I'm not even talking about just the West. Like Korean teams are a victim of this as well sometimes. And it's really peculiar to see constantly happen. And then the question then arises is, why does this keep happening? We're going into fucking season 8. I've been talking about this shit since like season 4. Because ultimately all that it is at the end of the day is a puzzle, right? It's abstract algebra. It's pattern recognition and realizing exactly like how are team compositions broken down. You just go step by step, you evaluate it, you see where the trade-offs lie with, the enemy team composition, and then you're going to ultimately have a conversation amongst the two team compositions that tell you where each other can try to find edges. And it's like people don't do it enough. They get so consumed in just playing out their own game. And playing out their own game is completely fine when you're better than the opponents. It's sort of like a Korean in StarCraft 1. They're just gonna, I'm just gonna build 4 Marines and a tank because there's no way that any rush beats that, right? It might not be the most advantageous, but it's gonna get me to mid game. And then mid game, I'm just gonna 200 and I'm gonna push out and you're gonna die. Like they could do that against Western StarCraft 1 players because the Protosses all sucked. They were all just worse. But you could not do that in OGN. Like the Protosses would know how to abuse you. They'd know how to take advantage of you, so you had to mix it up. But when you're TSM, you don't have to mix it up because you're in fucking North America.
So then here's a question then. The problem is TSM's lineup isn't new. I mean, they had it last year in summer and then at Worlds. And then, yes, they had Doublelift out in the spring, but the other players were there. And then in the summer, Doublelift came back. So they've won 2 splits of this lineup. They've been in 2 Worlds with this lineup. In theory, put it this way, if their coaching staff is good, then these players are just incapable of learning. I mean, how much more time do you need? You can't have like 3 years to practice to win a Worlds, like Korean teams, you just make a team and you fucking see how good you are. Like it's not a 3-year project, You just make a team. If it's good, it's good. If it's not, you make another team, So does that mean that this lineup of TSM, put it this way, we can't know which players necessarily made all the decisions. We can't know if the coach made it. But can we collectively say this exact lineup of TSM, it's broken, right? It doesn't work.
I think that it's probably broken, and it's probably just a bit unfortunate that they play in NA. I mean, you're always going to be at a disadvantage when your training partners are NA. Like the Chinese technically do get to play against Koreans. Like they play in a little bit of ping, but they do. Top Chinese teams get to play against Koreans. And then obviously Koreans benefit from just being in Korea. Taiwan gets to play with both Korea and China. NA just has suboptimal practice year round leading up to the tournament, Europe as well. People will rag on EU better than NA. And I mean, I think that Europeans historically, in most games are better than NA. Just at a competitional level, that comes down to like culture and work ethic and all this other type of stuff, right? TSM are fantastic in NA. They're great. But the problem is that how do you really get adequate practice when Haunster is allowed to make decisions like what he's making in the Worlds games, but the enemy teams are incapable of punishing the same way that Worlds teams are? And then you just play against that 100 games over. Now you might lose in the same manner that you lose in the Worlds games, But because it happens with such infrequent, like it happens so infrequently that you don't even pay attention to it because you chalk it up to something else. Or the same situation that causes you to have a huge problem in the world game occurs in a scrim versus an NA team. But then because you have Bjergsen and fucking Doublelift and Haunster's still better than most of the players, you just win out in the long game anyway. And then you never even assess the problem that you got into. And I mean, that's a problem in itself.
I mean, for Worlds, everyone goes and they have their boot camp and they scrim versus all the teams. So that's why I'm coming back to the fact that surely some of this has to come down to coaches as well. Because again, you are seeing these things. You're getting chances to learn from your mistakes, to identify things, to improve. And either nothing happened or if anything, you got worse.
Right. I don't know what's going on during the boot camps. I'm not, also, I think it's just, I'm not entirely defending the coaching staff of TSM at all. I'm just saying that their drafts are not fucking why they lost. You could have handed SKT, Longzhu, KT, you could fucking have handed Afrika, some of those drafts, and they would have smacked the opponent's team. So where the fuck's the draft talk in that? Like you're like whoever is saying that SKT or Longzhu or KT or Afrika, Samsung, etc. would have lost with some of those drafts against some of those teams, you're just fucking, I don't even know what to say, man. That just wouldn't have happened. And then what? Then what? Do you sit there with your thumb up your ass and you say, well, the enemy team had a bad draft? Because you know that they would. You know that suddenly the enemy team would have a bad draft, but that's not the case.
So here's why
I think it's... Yeah, go.
One thing that will trigger people about this interview, LS, is that you obviously have coached Western players. I mean, actually, you literally coached Holtz when he's on Gravity, right?
Yeah.
So you've coached some of these players. You worked with Tempo Storm recently, right? I assume you try and explain some of these concepts to these players, right? When you think it's pertinent. Do they just not get it? Do they get it, but then they just forget it a week later? What's it been like in your experience?
One of the things that, I mean, I've been talking about this recently, is it is amazing how little pros in the West know about each other's roles compared to a Korean.
Okay.
And that's actually a really big struggle to overcome.
Like give us a hypothetical. What kind of thing would...
Like, for instance, you might ask an AD carry to know stuff about a mid lane or a top lane matchup, or like how the top laner functions or what they're looking for, and they can't answer it.
Okay.
And then they think it's not their job. I think a Korean player would know a lot more. They wouldn't know it to the same level as like a world-class answer, but they know it a lot more. I mean, when Korean players come over to the West to boot camp, I think it's hilarious when they off-roll and smash pros consistently. I mean, this is something I think I said to you maybe a year ago or something in one of the videos, is that Korean pros can play off-rolls to a much higher level than Western players. And I mean, it was like that in StarCraft, right? You always heard about Flash or Jaedong or Bisu or Savior's off-rolls. Yes. They were monsters. You know, people used to say that Savior's Terran was almost as good as a Zerg because you were forced to learn it. In Korean solo queue, you're forced to learn other roles. So, I mean, you have people come over here for the boot camps and they play their main roles, and some of them have atrocious win ratios. Some of them have really good win ratios, but some of them have atrocious win ratios. Well, fucking now queue up for another role. How are you going to do? You know, so one of the real struggles is that Western players really do not care about each other's roles, and so when you try to talk about it, they view the talk from such a biased point of view because they actually don't entertain the other person's role, the other person's point of view. So it's almost like you waste so much time explaining the other role before you can even address the solution of the problem in the first place. Okay. And so it delays so much, and then it's like you can't even actually talk about the 5v5 component because you have to teach about the roles themselves first. And I know that sounds so fucking weird or strange, but it's a lot more common than one might think. Like how little they know about each other's roles. I'm not saying that they're completely clueless, but, you know.
So obviously a lot of the people that you know, have talked to, are friends with, are other coaches or analysts, etc., in the West, and they're people who study the game, watch all the Korean game. Do a decent amount of them understand these concepts?
Duncan, you're trying to get me to hang myself.
Just asking questions. Just a curious guy, you know.
I don't know. I mean, I've met some really smart people. I've met some really smart. I think someone that I was fascinated never got picked up because he was looking in the right direction, and that was more than I ever saw from like the public, right? Because most coaches and analysts, they can hide behind the fact that they never speak publicly. Right? You'll never find public videos. You'll never find public streams or anything actually analytical. They can just hide behind it all their fucking life. And then you have Reddit people that think that because someone's in the LCS or they're in Challenger Series, that they're in this, that they're instantly just more knowledgeable about the matter than anyone else that's not in it. Sure. There was a guy in, I think May, his name was like Croissant LoL or something. He made this breakdown of TSM versus G2.
I saw you tweeted this guy about
he was fantastic. He was easily the best person I ever saw come up since fucking 2015 or something. And I don't know what the fuck happened. I think he went with something that I advised him not to go with because it would have just locked him down and it would have delayed time before he could seek other jobs out again. And he never got picked up. And it's just mind-boggling to me because of the amount of nepotism that must have kept him out from getting a job, or just his cluelessness on how to actually wiggle his way in to securing it.
He didn't understand networking.
Yeah, he didn't understand it enough. And it's actually sort of heartbreaking in a way to see that happen because he was the best person that I ever saw publicly just making something. And it was like obvious to me. I remember Selfie was living with me, the mid laner, and he and I were both talking about the video, and I was like, this guy is not normal. Like this isn't normal. Most people don't do that. Like they can't talk about this. They can't even arrive at the points that he was getting to. And it was that like, I remember I went through the VOD with that same person, Croissant, on stream, and I think the video is up on YouTube somewhere. And there was some stuff that could have been refined a little bit more, but fucking goddamn if he wasn't really close, like to the optimal answer. And it was the point that he was looking. He at least found the fucking cave. You know what I mean? He might not have found the fossils or something, but he found the fucking cave, which is a lot better than most jackasses can do.
So then let me ask you this then. Yeah. So, like, is this a solution? If you are TSM, so you're Reginald, by the way, not only do TSM already have money, but in theory, they can raise a lot from investment, etc., as we know from NALCS franchising and potentially an Overwatch League slot, which they're not doing, but they definitely could have if they wanted to, right? Then would a solution be you go and you get a coach that was a KT roster coach, or you go and you sign some guy who's been working with Samsung or something, and you just tell this guy, listen, it's going to be tough because we're going to need a translator and stuff, but your job is to teach these guys the concepts, the macro concepts, the how to use wave manipulation, when to back, etc. You're going to teach them all these things because the idea is they're going to know that you know the shit. Is that a solution?
I think it's disingenuous to assume that Korean coaches know a lot because some of them don't. Some of them do, like Nofei.
You think the players mainly learn this shit? It's not the coach who learns it and teaches the players?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
I think that's why you can literally, I mean, Longzhu was put together and now they're like the best team in the world. You can't do that in the West. You just can't do it. You can't throw them together right before summer split and then Royal Road to Worlds and fucking Longzhu's going to win Worlds. So, I mean, we'll talk about that later, but you can't have that happen. It's because the players all know so much about the game. Okay. Like that's just ultimately like the problem. And it goes back to how little the Western players know about each other's roles because they slack off with solo queue. Right. There was already a Reddit post that proved that. And I remember arguing with certain Western players about it, that Koreans do play a lot more than Western players. Sure. Not only do they slack off with solo queue, they slack off with practice. Culturally, they fucking jerk off when they do play solo queue. They don't take it as serious. They don't play off roles. They don't understand enough about each other's off roles, etc. And their scrims are inadequate. Right? In the sense that there's not as much direction and intent when going into them. And obviously the practice is just less efficient because the opposition is worse, right? It's like fucking, you're fighting against fucking just B tier players or something. How do you as TSM maintain a level that can actually clash with the best in the world? TSM could probably be a lot better than they are if they gave up NALCS, they came to Korea, and they lived in Korea for a year.
That's probably a pipe dream. I agree. The premise is nice,
pipe dream, but they would Idra the shit out of NA. Okay. It's exactly what they would do. They would just completely Idra the fuck out of North America. They would come to Korea, they
if
would.
we can't
be
get the
into-
coaches, then
yeah.
what about this? You can't get the coaches because maybe it's a role.
Well, I want to point out what Loco said on the coach thing.
Yeah.
So Loco, I think, made a tweet saying that like there was a coach that was like super, super good, and obviously he's good in Korea, but apparently in NA it just doesn't work. Like he just can't deal with the culture.
Right.
It's not the coach's job.
Okay.
What
about this then?
I mean,
if the players are really knowledgeable, then okay, new tactic. So hold on to that blank check, Reginald. We're not going to give it to a coach because fuck those guys anyway. What we're going to do instead is we're just going to tell fucking Bengi, like Bengi, come on mate, you've literally been on all the world's teams for SK Telecom. All you're going to do is I'm just going to show you VODs and you're just going to tell me what the top laner did wrong, what the AD carry did wrong. He's not going to get to play the games. I'm not fucking mentally ill, but he's just going to tell us what they did wrong and he's going to impart some of his knowledge. You must know a fuck ton about the game, right? That guy had pathing like a motherfucker, so would that work?
I think
Bengi save us.
Holy shit, Jesus Christ! I think doing stuff like that would help, but then the question is how well is it received by the players?
Okay.
Because that's a problem in itself, you know. Like, so here's the thing, right? Is like when this goes up on Reddit and everything, I'm gonna get a lot of flack, right? Because if LS knows so much, then how come the team goes as in one world? And basically, the answer to that is that if anything that I'm saying is wrong, then you present me a more optimal answer, right? You either find error in the statement and show that it's wrong, rather than just dismissing it with either like a fucking red herring or some other asinine type comment, right? But they're not going to do that. So basically, when you show a player that they were wrong or that they made an error in a judgment or something, part of the struggle is getting them to accept it.
Okay.
And that's difficult in itself. So you could bring over someone to teach them stuff, but if they don't want to accept it, they just won't accept it.
Okay.
I've
got a question. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So one of the things that I am quite confused about is any game that tends to have depth has people who are going as deep as you can. They're studying theory, they're working on concepts. Like obvious examples would be chess, poker. Mm-hmm. I mean, I would even go as far as StarCraft, these are all games like that. There doesn't really seem to be many of those people in the West. I know people tried to have like the Summoner School sub, and some people tried to do articles. I realize it wouldn't be that popular with the public. Like, it's not a great idea to be a journalist and do these articles. You'll just waste your time doing 1 million hours of VOD review, and then people will be like, I don't understand what he's talking about, and that'll be it. But are there actually people in the West who they go in super deep? I mean, you've listed one guy, but it sounds like a lot of people. Like, I don't want to be too cynical, but it sounds like a lot of people almost get limited by the fact that they are a journalist. So, for example, if you're a journalist, just stick to the simple things. Do you think they did a good draft? Did this player overperform? Whatever. There's no point really going beyond that because actually it would be diminishing returns for your time. But you would think with how many coaches and ex-pros there are, you'd think there'd be more people who kind of, whether or not the players can play to a Korean level, you'd think there'd be more people who could think to a level. I mean, there's nothing inside Koreans' brains making them think better.
No, they're not.
There's no limitation there, right?
Right. They're not superior, like genetically superior or anything like that. I think that the problem is so we've talked about nepotism, right? But then people want to keep their jobs. So if they start saying something and it doesn't have an immediate solution or like doesn't have an immediate effect that's positive, they get afraid and they kowtow to whatever it is that they need to say or do in order to remain with their job. And that's a very toxic mindset. Right? Because what it means is that you actually withhold information or corrections that might be accurate or able to help in the long run in order to have a better face inside of a team or a better standing or something, and then it ends up hurting you. The other thing is like one of the reasons that I primarily stopped doing VOD review a long time ago, right, was because I just realized that like the public is so oblivious to entertaining all the possible outcomes to a team fight or a rotation or something like that, right? Sure. So they can have two people do a VOD review, two entirely different people, and at the end of the day, they will see. So if I present an argument and I say that okay, this player should have done this because this is the movement speed of the champion, which means that he is limited. He's confined by the laws of the game. This player should move here and do this, and then his teammates should do this, right? And you have to offer a rebuttal using the same laws of the game, the same movement speed, the same damage, etc. You must use that. But then, Captain Billy Bob over on the left does the same VOD review, and he says something that's different from mine, but it doesn't offer a rebuttal to the laws of the game that I've already presented or something. The public can't determine which one's right. And that's sort of like sickening in a way, that they can't see that this isn't an opinion here. Like this champion's movement speed is set in stone. Their damage is set in stone. What they can do is set in stone, like their skill set, whether or not they have an ultimate available or something. It's not an opinion at the end of the day. Some of these things are not opinions anyway, right? But people aren't capable of seeing it as such. And so you get these people that think that anyone who does a fucking VOD review is somehow knowledgeable about the game, or that they're equally knowledgeable about the game. And that's really concerning to me. And if that's concerning to me, then I can only fucking imagine how concerning it might be to someone that is like that croissant guy who's trying to get into the scene. And his work, even if it's like fucking Michelangelo type shit, might just actually not get seen by anyone. It might not get any upvotes. Okay. Might just go by the fucking wayside.
Yeah, for sure.
Because people don't. Who are you? A person's name shouldn't mean that something is more right or wrong. If I offer something that's like, oh well, Haunter shouldn't have done this rotation, it's not fucking right because I'm LS. It's either right or wrong because you can't find a more optimal rotation or a more optimal answer, or you know what I mean? Like.
If Reginald offers
I'm fucking LS.
If Reginald offers you a blank check, you'll come and coach TSM next year. We'll fix all this shit.
First off, they would never have me because only like 2 of the players I think like me.
I'll put in a good word for you. It's all right. So
God bless. They would. I would not want to deal with it. Like I just don't. I don't think I would want to deal with it. And then obviously Reddit responded, well, TSM wouldn't have LS anyway. Fucking morons. But anyways, I just don't think it would ever happen.
Okay.
I don't think it would ever happen.
Okay. Is there any final message we want to leave on this interview? It's gone in a dark route. We've killed everyone. No one knows anything. They're all worthless, basically, and even Korean coaches. So, is there some light at the end of the tunnel, LS? Is there some way we can end this?
No. Holy shit, we're doomed.
Is that just it? Is that
Remove the import rule. Maybe then NA will
Okay, there we go. Right. Yeah, that's the secret. Just literally get Longzhu. Right, that's it.
Literally buy them, yeah.
I'm Kelsey Moser, and you're watching Thorin's YouTube channel, where no sandbagging goes unscrutinized.